Our first speaker today is our headline keynote speaker, and he is involved in many of these debates. His country is at the center of many of these debates, and that's Prime Minister Hsien Loong of Singapore. Prime Minister Lee is one of the most experienced, most knowledgeable, and most respected leaders in the world today. He's been Prime Minister of Singapore since 2004, Secretary General of the People's Action Party, Member of Parliament since 1984. He's held many of the top ministerial posts in his country. And I'm very proud to say, as a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, he's one of the most renowned graduates of the Harvard Kennedy School. And so we look forward to a discussion with the Prime Minister and the unique role his country is playing as a close friend of the United States, and also a country that has a leading trade relationship with China and lots of insights into the People's Republic of China itself. Prime Minister Lee is going to be interviewed by our friend, Evan Osnos of The New Yorker. Evan, one of the top journalists in the United States. You know about his book, his prize-winning book on China, Age of Ambition. You should read his new book, Wild Land, The Making of America's Fury. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Evan Osnos and particularly our keynote speaker, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore.
Thank you, Ambassador Burns. I think we're going to get the Prime Minister back up here. Terrific. We are in very good hands, whether you're in Washington or Aspen. It's great to be back with you here. And I want to say that there have been a number of us who have been looking forward to this session, Prime Minister Lee. You and I were last together in person, I should say, on a stage, on a conversation of this kind about 4 years ago. And as you and I were just discussing a few minutes ago, 4 years these days feels like a very long time indeed. There's been a lot of changes politically, geopolitically, economically, and of course, when it comes to public health and the COVID pandemic. I thought, and you and I talked about this, it might be helpful at the very outset here if you would share with us some of your own comments, some of the things that are on your mind, what's top of mind for you. And what we'll do is talk for, if you want to talk for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll open this up to a conversation, and we'll go from there. And eventually we'll have some Q&A with the audience. But with that, Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Evan. Happy to talk to you again, and very happy to be here virtually with everyone. It's one of the new, hopefully temporary realities of dealing with COVID-19. Thankfully, many countries are in a better position now, with more people vaccinated. But with the Delta variant spreading and future variants entirely possible, the way forward will be complicated. We had all hoped that the pandemic would prompt countries to work more closely together, just as after 9/11, when there was a period of solidarity and mutual support against extremist terrorism. But unfortunately, with COVID-19, it's been quite different. Yes, there's been some cooperation, like on vaccine multilateralism or the COVAX initiative, and international commerce has also been maintained. But more broadly, COVID-19 hasn't brought countries closer together. In fact, often on the contrary. There was a scramble for critical supplies like masks and PPEs, and later vaccines. And internationally, the pandemic has spawned recriminations and finger pointing. Where did the virus come from? Who is to blame? And so on. Domestically, populations in many countries feel growing anxiety and insecurity, which has fed nativist sentiments. One major international development this past year has been the change of the US administration. The US has returned to a more conventional approach to foreign policy, a renewed emphasis on multilateralism, and has refocused on its global network of allies and partners. There's a palpable sense of relief, not just in the Asia Pacific, but all around the world. Countries are looking for long-term strategic consistency from the US. They hope that it will sustain such a policy, not just for now or the next 2 or 3 years, but for the long term, beyond the midterms and the next presidential elections. They hope for a reliable and predictable US, which will provide a stable anchor for the international order, as it has done for so many decades. On one central issue, there has unfortunately been continuity, and that is US-China bilateral relations. These became more difficult during the last few years. In the US, this is reflected in a deep shift in attitudes towards China, which is bipartisan and extends beyond the administration and the Congress into the population. And the same forces constrain and shape the policies of the current US administration towards China, as shaped the previous administration. In China, too, attitudes have become more assertive and robust. China's strategic and economic influence has grown. It's taken on a more active international stance. It seeks to reshape the international order to its advantage. I think it'll be hard to reverse the present trend towards more troubled relations, but many countries still hope that the deterioration in the relationship can be checked. Because many US friends and allies wish to preserve their extensive ties with both powers. No good outcome can arise from a conflict. It's vital for the US and China to strive to engage each other to head off a clash, which would be disastrous for both sides and the world. Meanwhile, we are glad the US is actively visiting countries in the Asia Pacific at a high level. Secretaries of State Blinken and Secretary Austin have visited Japan and Korea. Secretary Austin was also recently in Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And Vice President Harris is visiting Singapore and Vietnam in a fortnight's time. Such high-level visits are greatly valued. They show that the US is investing the bandwidth and the resources in the region, and shows that it knows it has substantial stakes and interests there to protect and to advance. And the US is in the Asia Pacific, not just to ensure regional security and a balance of power, but also to advance these interests, to drive trade and investment, and to grow the broad trans-Pacific relationship. The current mood in the US is not pro-trade, but there are many new opportunities for the US to cooperate with the region. For example, in digital trade and green growth. So I hope the US will pursue them and continue to play a major role in fostering an inclusive, rules-based world order. Thank you.
Prime Minister, thank you very much. You hit on a number of issues that I think are very much top of mind for people here in the US. I want to follow up, if I can, please, on what is really one of the core points, which is this question of the US-China relationship. You know, as you know, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in Singapore just recently, and he attracted some attention because he said that China's claims and actions in the Indo-Pacific, as he put it, threaten the sovereignty of nations around the region. We're now in this period that here in the world of China analysis doesn't yet have a name. We're no longer in the era of engagement with China in quite the same way we were. The Biden administration talks about what it calls extreme competition. I wonder if you would share with us your level of concern today about the state of affairs between US and China. Where are you on the temperature scale? How concerned are you, and where do you think it's heading over the course of the next few weeks and months ahead?
Well, we are concerned. This is not a burning issue which will explode on you tomorrow, but it is a progressive issue which is with very serious consequences. It comes down basically to how the US sees China and how China sees the US. And for a long time, the US saw China as a country it could work with. You had disagreements, you had many disputes, many issues on trade and currencies and human rights and so on, but basically there was space for them, and you talked about responsible stakeholders, and you looked to China to be one of them. And China was quite happy to be in this flanking position. They were not in a position to challenge you, but they were happy to fly in your wake and enjoy the toll. But it's reached a point where China is not so small anymore. It's grown dramatically. It continues to grow, although people say it's aging and the growth rates are slowing down. And its ambitions have grown together with its ability to influence events in the region and in the world. But especially in the region, because it considers Asia as its near abroad, if you use an old Soviet era term or Russian term. And now from America's point of view, you're seeing a competitor, one which has strengths, one which is challenging you, perhaps not challenging you ideologically the way the Soviet Union did, but challenging you as an alternative center of influence and prosperity, and vying with you certainly for its space in Asia. And you have to decide how you're going to react. And for a long time, the Americans were quite confident, don't worry, we'll have free competition, let the best man win. And you have no doubt, you would say quietly, the best man shall be the United States. And now you're not quite sure of that last bit. And so you say, well, I must win one way or the other. And I still believe in competition, but I would like the competition to be fair. But it's a very fine line and between that, from that to treating the competitor as the opponent or an adversary. And President Biden has said there will be extreme competition, but not necessarily, he doesn't need conflict. Well, we all hope so, and we all hope that the line is clearly drawn, but it's not easy to maintain that line because I think within the US, there's a strong bipartisan consensus that the old model is broken and you need to take a more robust approach, and one which will, to some considerable extent, lead at the very least to bifurcation of technology, of access to talent, even of capital markets. On the other side, I think the rhetoric says all the right things, that there's a multilateral world, there's no single center of wisdom or power, and we all have to work together, and win-win is much better than win-lose. And all these things are true. But at the same time, the Chinese have to look at America and say, is this a country which is going to countenance my rise? Or is this a country which wants, at the very least, to slow down my emergence? And I think that after what has happened over the last, it's more than one administration, a significant number of people in China, probably at a high level, have concluded that you can't safely assume that intentions will always be benign. And so in this dynamic, to try and restore trust and work with one another, I think that takes statesmanship as well as courage, as well as political leadership domestically in both countries. Because in America, if you take Pew surveys, the mood is strongly against China. And if you take China, they have domestic opinion too. And the domestic opinion extremely nationalistic. And the wolf warrior diplomacy is very popular in China. I think the meeting in Anchorage is, well, it's part of the theatrics, but I'm not sure it's a right first act to a play which ends up with a happy conclusion. That's what many countries worry about.
You mentioned a couple of times, I think, a very important piece of this, which is the sense that in Washington, this harder turn towards China is now a bipartisan position. I think it took a little while for that idea perhaps to be absorbed in Beijing. It felt as if this was an artifact of the Trump era. Now where it's clear evidence that we have a new administration in Washington. I know, Prime Minister, that you're vigilant about not giving advice to your friends in foreign governors and governments. You try to share your views, hear their views. But if I might for a moment, don't give them advice. If I might, though, share with us, if you could, please, your sense of how you have sought to explain to the Biden administration, and then we'll talk perhaps about to Beijing. What is the message that you want the Biden administration to understand about this moment in US-China relations that you think may not be getting through in the usual in the usual discourse of public affairs?
Well, there are many issues, there are many disputes, there will be many legitimate grievances even on both sides. But the reality is neither side can put the other one down. I think that is a possible misunderstanding on both sides. Because in China, people say the East is rising and the West is declining. And they believe that some people believe, and write about it, that America is in terminal decline. I don't think so. I tell them, you look at all the science Nobel Prize winners and medicine who are Chinese ethnic. And all of them were either American citizens or became American citizens, except for one who's a Chinese citizen. And there's a moral in that. America is able to attract people from all over the world, great talent and vibrancy and ability to reinvent itself and pick itself up again after it appears to be heading irrevocably in the wrong direction for a long time, which sometimes happens. On the other side, I don't know whether Americans realize what a formidable adversary they would be taking on if they decide that China is an enemy. You've spent 20 years in Afghanistan, you've spent quite a long time in Iraq. These are small countries. I mean, blood and treasure is not enough. But China is not going to disappear. This is not the Soviet Union. It is not the Potemkin Village front. This is a country with enormous dynamism, energy, talent, and determination to take its place in the world again. Some of it, no doubt, is because of skillful, Chinese would call it mass line work, but skillful presentation of a view of the world to the population. But a lot of it is very deep pride and confidence in a population which feels that it has been downtrodden, perhaps has had the victim narrative put into them a bit more than others might have done, but rightly remembering where they came from and determined to go forward, and they are not going to disappear. So in this situation, I would say to both, pause, think carefully before you fast forward. It's very dangerous.
On that score, and we do have a range of other topics we're going to talk about today, but before we leave the subject of the US and China behind, I think there's something that's very much on people's minds these days in Washington, and that's the subject of Taiwan. As you know, there have been headlines everywhere about the possibility that there could be a Chinese move towards Taiwan, and something that would seize greater control, that would disrupt the status quo. How concerned are you about the risks of a Chinese move like that? And just for folks who are listening but may not remember a couple of data points, the head of Indo-Pacific Command said in March that he believed that that China was on course to have the capability within the next 6 years or so to take control of Taiwan. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, spoke recently on the subject. Help us set our levels, if you would, Prime Minister. How concerned are you? What do you think the likelihood would be, and what would the impact be, please?
Well, I'd put it like this. My take, I don't think they want to make a unilateral move, but I think there is a danger, and the danger is of miscalculation or mishap. So you're not in a dangerous position, but you can get into a dangerous position quite easily. For the Chinese, Taiwan is the mother of all core interests. I mean, it is the most important national subject for them. And Taiwan independence is an absolute bright red line. Mr. Xi has put Taiwan reunification as part of his great rejuvenation vision, but actually it's not just President Xi who has this vision. This is, in fact, the unanimous view throughout China, through the intelligentsia, the armed forces, even the population. It's a very deep view, and it's a reality. So the path ahead, in the first instance, under Deng Xiaoping, the idea was one country, two systems. Do it with Hong Kong, make it a model which works. hope that the model can apply to Taiwan. I don't think, even before the recent developments in Hong Kong, that was taking off. Certainly in Taiwan, I think there's very little support for such an idea. And what was a workable approach for at least maintaining relations and developing cooperation was what was called the 92 consensus. One of these precisely vague statements that there's one China, but to each its own interpretation. So on that basis, they were able to work together with several KMT governments, but now in Taiwan, but now Tsai Ing-wen has said, no, the 92 consensus is not acceptable. And it's going to be very, very difficult to work out an alternative basis for, or an alternative form of words for cooperation. So you are in for a quite difficult period, especially as the Taiwanese population's attitudes have been shifting. So 2/3 of Taiwanese now think of themselves as Taiwanese and also want to maintain the status quo. So it's a situation where the mainland is looking carefully, wondering what they can do. If they squeeze, it turns the Taiwanese against them. If they relax, they fear that the Taiwanese will have more open space, international space. So I think that they are going to constrain Taiwan's international space as much as they can, but I do not think that they will make a unilateral, unprovoked move. It's high risk, and even if it works, the victory would be Pyrrhic. Because what to do with 20-something million people on an island who are not willing citizens? So a unilateral, unprovoked move, I think, is not likely, but a miscalculation or a mishap can easily lead you to a place where you do not want to be. Some of you may remember in 2001, there was an EP-3 accident and incident when an EP-3 off the Chinese coast brushed against a Chinese fighter. The Chinese fighter crashed and pilot died. And the EP-3 had to make an emergency landing in Hainan Island, and you spent several weeks working out an apology to get the aircraft and crew back. I think if something like that happened today, you would be in quite a hard spot. I'm not sure it would have a similarly benign outcome. So it's a very difficult position. I think the American stance is crucial. Over the last few years, I think America has been taking noticeable steps to engage Taiwan more visibly, including military flights, including diplomatic invitations, visits, and so on. So I think that will be watched carefully on both sides of the straits. I would say that the official position which this administration has taken has been a very careful one. Lloyd Austin was in Singapore recently. He was asked about this, and what he said was important, although it wasn't very much picked up, but I'll quote what he said. He said two things. One, no one wants to see a unilateral change in the status quo with respect to Taiwan. That means nobody is supposed to make a unilateral change, and please make no mistake about that. And secondly, that gloss is mine, not his. And secondly, the US is committed to supporting Taiwan in its capability to defend itself in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act and the US's One China policy. In other words, the US is taking the position which it has taken for several administrations. It's a careful statement. It's a statement to both sides that unilateral acts to change the status quo are not welcome. And what the US will do is carefully spell out in terms of the limits of what you're prepared, where you're prepared to go. And I think if that careful position is clearly and consistently maintained, then we are able to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait which is crucial to the whole region. And I think likely crucial to your overall relationship with China too. So it is something to worry about, but it is not tomorrow's conflict. It's something over a medium term.
Thank you for that. You will talk about something that may be, in fact, the short-term issue, something that is right in our windscreen at the moment, and that, of course, is the impact of the COVID pandemic. I want to talk, if we can, for a moment, picking up on something you mentioned, Prime Minister, in your opening comments. You pointed out that this period, we've seen this rising sense of insecurities, a rising nativist sentiment in some places. The reason why I link this to the COVID pandemic is I think there is a feeling that this has been a period in which, in many respects, COVID has begun to cast doubt on some of the globalist impulse, the globalizing impulse that has been so much a part of our world for the last 2 generations. It's been a big part of Singapore's success, the idea of being integrated with the global economy, about being able to travel, being able to absorb talent from around the world, and so on. You've talked about a new normal these days, and in contending with the pandemic and post-pandemic era. It may take a while to work its way through. But if you would, share with us your thoughts on this subject of globalism, whether we're experiencing a pressure against it, a reaction against it. Do you see this as a temporary phenomenon? Do you see this as something we're going to be contending with for years to come? How do you see this counter-global trend evolving in the years ahead?
I think the pushback preceded COVID, but COVID probably accentuated it. The economic logic of globalization is still valid. In fact, more than ever, because if you are going for new technologies and even higher tech, like with semiconductors or aircraft, you're talking about bigger and bigger economies of scale, and you need the global market as well as a global division of labor, manufacturing, and talent in order to make it happen so that you can make something which all of us can use. It's very difficult to have Americans flying American aeroplanes and Chinese flying Chinese aeroplanes and the Russians flying Russian aeroplanes. Not even America is big enough to do that, or China. But there is a pushback. I think there's a pushback, firstly, because people are looking for more onshoring. They're looking for more economic security. They're scared. They can't get their masks or gloves or vaccines. There's pushback because of the insecurity felt by the population. So it leads to nativist sentiments, and therefore governments have to respond to that. And that's not just trade, but especially, I think, movement of people. Not just migrants who are wetbacks, but professionals looking for opportunities, traveling, looking for H-1B visas. Even they are seen as potentially threats to the domestic population and therefore needing to be regulated. And you also have not a pushback, but a pressure against globalization, which comes from geopolitics, because countries' relations with each other are such that you no longer can assume that the trade is trade and politics is politics. The two get entangled, and therefore when I allow trade, I must decide what the politics will be. And that leads not just to less trade, but even to bifurcation and many far deeper consequences. So there will be impact on globalization. I think on trade itself, strictly speaking, yes, you will lose some, but it's not an all or nothing thing. On investments, physical investments, projects, as well as financial investments, listings on stock exchanges, I think the impact will be significant. We have a strange situation now where there are countries, America doesn't want Chinese companies to list in America, and China doesn't want Chinese companies to list in America, in New York. So it's strange that both sides should think it's bad for them, but that means you're in a lose-lose situation, but it's a reality. Then you have the impact on movement of people, which I'm sure will be significant. It was a very big factor in Brexit, and it's not absent from any of our politics. And even in Singapore, where we have a significant number of migrant workers as well as foreign professionals, it's a sensitive political issue. And we have to put a lot of effort into managing the relations and explaining to Singaporeans why this is necessary and how the issues can be managed. At the same time as we explain to the foreign population here that their contributions and their economic efforts are appreciated. And if it is so for Singapore, where the arguments are stark, you can imagine how much more difficult it is in other countries where it may appear that I can do without the rest of the world and still get along fine for a while. Seems so, but not so. So where does that take us? I think it takes us somewhere closer back to where we were after the Second World War. Trade was not so open, but was opening up gradually, and you had GATT rounds, and so you gradually co-prospered. But it was a time when movement of people certainly wasn't hardly anything, and capital flows were also hardly globalized. Certainly financial markets were not globalized, but there was cooperation and we could work together to some extent. There'll be economic losses because so many opportunities to do things together will be foregone. But what we worry about, both from the general restriction on the interdependence, and also if you bifurcate and divide into two, is that we no longer have stakes in one another's success. I'm no longer prospering because of you, because I have investments in your country, and you have successful companies investing in my country. So with less stakes in one another, I think the chances of our becoming rivals, becoming opponents or more are greater. It's a less stable situation, but it's the way it is. In the best outcome, hopefully we dial back from where we were with the excesses of globalization. Nobody believes you have one single capital market for the whole world without any borders anymore. Even the IMF acknowledges that sometimes capital controls are necessary. So with safeguards, with firewalls, with safety nets, we can still reap most of the benefits of globalization. I think that would be the Goldilocks scenario. But you could have another situation where you have bifurcation and then you have countries have to choose. And I think that's not a stable situation, but it could happen. In the Cold War, it was bifurcated, but one side didn't matter to the rest of the world and the other side was big enough and was most of the world. I mean, the free world was the economy and the Soviet part. They had Comecon, but it wasn't a serious proposition. But here, when all of the countries in Asia and many of the countries in Europe have China as their biggest trading partner and America as a very major friend and sometimes ally, to have a bifurcation means you've got to split down the middle of many societies, which I think is going to be very hard. Mm. So at the same time, you really want to go into new areas of cooperation. You want a digital economy, you're talking about data flows, you need to work on green economy, you need to work on climate change, you need to cooperate with one another on so many global issues. And if we are at loggerheads on globalization fundamentally, I think all those issues are going to become even more intractable than they already are. And that would not just be a pity, it could well be a disaster for the world.
You have, of course, you mentioned a moment ago some of the ways in which there may be opportunities for cooperation. I think it would be encouraging for folks to hear a bit more about what you have in mind in terms of opportunities where the United States and China, for instance, might be able to still find these areas of common ground. Singapore is perhaps the world's leading expert at being able to stay friends with multiple sides in a complicated world. How do you think about the way that the U.S. and China might be able to find some areas? What specifically do you think could be a path forward that would
Well, John Kerry has just been in China. He's your climate change special envoy. That's a very big issue which cannot be solved without both America and China fully pitching in. And neither side can pitch in unless both have pitched in. Even then, you'll have quite a busy time persuading Congress. So that's one very big issue. But there are other areas as well where you need to work together. If we're talking about nuclear non-proliferation, you want to deal with North Korea, you cannot do it without China. If you want to talk about a digital economy, you want to go it alone and make your own thing. But it's not really practical to take all of the electronic supply chain and put it in the US. I mean, possibly you spend a lot of money, you could get some distance, but it's such a globally diversified operation and China is so deeply engaged in it that to cut China out of it, you can't even, by the time you're unable to buy a DJI drone to monitor forest fires in the US. I think there'll be many more hard choices you're going to make if you take the bifurcation to its extreme limits. It doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And on the Chinese side as well, it doesn't make sense for them because they know, and they must know that however great, extensive, and diverse their country is, they are no longer, and they are not the whole world. And there are others, there's technology elsewhere, there are resources elsewhere, there are capabilities elsewhere, and you have to work together in order to make progress. Mm.
Do you think, I want to, something you mentioned a moment ago is, in your opening remarks, was about the consistency of American policy. This is something that you mentioned a couple of times, and I wonder if you would give our audience a bit of a temperature check around the globe. The last 4 years, the last 5 years in American politics have been turbulent, and to say the least. And I wonder if you can give us some candid talk for a moment about whether American partners and competitors around the world are looking at us and saying, okay, we think that was a confined period. They may seem to be back on a more stable footing now. Or how does our politics look around the world today, Prime Minister? What do you think the impact is on American strength and America's position in the world?
Well, I think many countries are watching anxiously America. We understand the social strains which beset your different states, blue states, red states, the blue collar, the white collar. You have got, somebody wrote a piece recently on how there are 4 different Americas. Yeah. You have the,
George Packer's piece, yeah,
that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And these are real strains in the society which the politics will reflect and have to reflect. But at the same time, you have long-term interests, which really, if you analyze it, do not go for or against one side or the other. That America wants to maintain its place in the world, I think whether you're blue or red, that is something which you would like to have. You want America to stand tall in the world. You want America to be at peace with their neighbors and with others. You want to be able to make a commitment and to have that commitment stick. And if the president says something, you must have some confidence that it is something which can be followed through and not something which can be overturned by a new executive order. So that is something which we would very much like to see. I mean, the policies, these are important. The implementation, that shows that you're actually doing it. But to make it stick, you really need a broader consensus that this is a direction the country is going. And on foreign policy of all things, I think it's easier to reach a consensus than it is on health care. Should be, has been. For many years it was so, and politics stopped at the shoreline, and when it came to foreign policy and security matters, well, there's bipartisan consensus. And if you could maintain that, that would be good. There's bipartisan consensus today on one thing, which is relations with China, but there the stance is to take a hard line And I'm not sure that is a right consensus, but that's the way the mood is today, and maybe it will shift. We hope it can shift in a considered and thoughtful way.
In a few minutes, we're going to move to Q&A, but before we do, and I want to encourage people, if they have their questions, of course, to put them in into the chat function, into the Q&A function. One question before we turn to that is about trade. I know there are a lot of people who are going to be very interested in the question of as you've said, the U.S. is not likely, not in the cards to join the CPTPP. But I wondered if you would just speak for a moment about what you think the impact of the U.S. staying out will be. What impact does this have on China's position in the region? And how do you think we should anticipate the effects in the United States? I think you're still muted, actually. You're still muted.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. Perfect.
Okay. It's water under the bridge. President Obama put a lot of effort into negotiating the TPP deal, but at the end, he couldn't get it across the line. And so he didn't join, and the other countries carried on and made it the CPTPP, but basically the same deal. On your side, what happened is that elements of the deal were taken up by the Trump administration and used in their new NAFTA arrangement, the USMCA. In fact, some pieces of that were originally negotiated in the CPTPP. So you're not in it now. I think it's a loss to the United States. Because when you are engaging the Asia Pacific, it's not just the 7th Fleet or Indo-PACOM. You also have investments, you also have trade, you also have interests, you have people there, and you have got very deep trans-Pacific interactions which are mutually beneficial. And it is only sustainable for you to be leaning forward with security forces and military forces if at the same time you're able to say, and countries that are able to say, well, this is not just military, but there are deep economic interests which both sides are advancing. There's a shared objective, and therefore it is something worth working together on. And you do not go around like other countries may do, distributing little bits of confetti as foreign aid, and then that counts as the reason why, well, countries will adhere to you. You are looking for one significant move which is substantial and is worth doing. And the TPP was meant to be that substantial move. You decided not to opt in, well, we accept that. If you ask me in terms of economic dollars and cents, it's a few percentage points on the GDP, maybe not, maybe even a little bit less than that. But in terms of the symbolic importance of your deciding not to commit, I think that leaves a deep impression. Because at the same time as we're talking about trans-Pacific cooperation, we're also talking about cooperation within Asia, amongst the Asian countries. And we actually have a free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. And that includes China, India, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Australasia. It's broader, not so deep as the TPP would have been, but it has substantial scope, and it is the right architecture for Asia, except that at the last minute, the Indian said, I'm not ready to join yet. So we have regional cooperation progressing, fits and starts, but it's progressing. And to make the most sense, trans-Pacific cooperation needs to progress also. So we hope that it is possible one day for America to come back, when the constellations come back in alignment and you can join the TPP. That may be a while, but meanwhile, I mean, the digital economy is growing. Meanwhile, the green economy is important. And we should be able to talk about digital economy agreements. We should be able to talk about green economy cooperation, standards for climate change cooperation. These are areas where you can talk about substantive items which are beneficial to both sides and, we hope, politically more doable in the immediate future.
Prime Minister, I have one more question, and then they'll snatch this away from me. I have to say, we could talk all day, but we're going to have Q&A from the audience in just a moment. But before we do, I think it's essential for us to talk just briefly about the current state of affairs on the COVID pandemic. Here in the United States, of course, we're contending with a spike in cases as a result of the Delta variant. You have been dealing with some of that in Singapore yourself. For people who don't know, Singapore has been applauded over the course of the last 18 months for its handling of the pandemic. I think you were ranked number 1 and 2 in the Bloomberg resilience scale. We're struggling here. We're trying to get our arms around it and make sure that the progress that's been achieved so far can be sustained through the rest of the challenges ahead. But I wondered if you would tell us about your sense of the risks posed by the Delta variant to the progress that's been achieved so far. What are you preparing to do in Singapore? Do you expect that we will be heading back into the kind of lockdowns that we've had before, or do you think we'll be able to manage with a smaller degree of intervention?
Well, first of all, we take all these rankings about who's doing better and worse on COVID with a big pinch of salt. Because every time you think you are doing better, something can happen. It's happened to all the countries, it's happened to us from time to time, and we've learned to have a very healthy respect for this enemy we're dealing with. COVID has been, the Delta variant has been a very unwelcome new surprise in a whole series of surprises. We first got it probably in April, and we've had several outbreaks since then, a few hundreds each time. This time, 1,000 plus 2,000. It's extremely contagious. It's very difficult to tamp down. And the only solution which we can have will be vaccination. Vaccinate nearly everybody, vaccinate as quickly as you can. That's what we are doing. We're making progress. But looking at the transmissivity and the experience of other countries, it looks like you have to vaccinate a huge proportion of the population in order to get herd immunity if that is at all possible. I mean, you look at Provincetown, where they're all vaccinated. They had one party on July the 4th, and suddenly you got an outbreak all over America. So we are under no illusions about the challenge of the COVID-19. We are almost at 70% two-dose vaccinations. We should be there within a week or so. But I don't think 70% is the end point. We're trying to push it higher than that. As we get there, we plan gradually to ease up on the safe management measures that we have. We think that a big bang is taking more risk than is necessary, but we will move incrementally, and we will see how the disease spreads. It won't go to zero. It will be in the community. Question is, will it be at a wearable level? And in particular, will the minority of people, old people, who are vulnerable, be sufficiently protected? And if that can be done, then we can take further cautious steps forward. But it's not, we're treating this as a public health thing and a public morale thing, explaining to people why the twists and turns happen to us, and we have to be as supple as the virus. But it is tough, and people do get tired.
Prime Minister, we've got questions lined up for you, and I'll turn first, if I can, to Neve King, who has a queued up question for you. Ready to go.
Great. Thanks very much, Evan. Thank you, Prime Minister. We have several questions, Mr. Prime Minister, in the chat box about your thoughts on a digital currency for Singapore. Could you let us know any thoughts on that, please? Thank you.
Well, we've got various electronic mechanisms for payment, so people can do without checks and without cash, which have been quite successful. We have not done a central bank digital currency yet. We're studying it, but we haven't made any decision. I don't think it is something which is a top priority for us. We are trying to go cashless and paperless, but we do not see us going 100% of the way.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I believe now we have a question from Professor Joe Nye. Over to you, please, Professor Nye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Prime Minister, we spoke a little bit earlier about the problem of Xinjiang and human rights. And obviously, you don't want to see a breaking of relations over Xinjiang. On the other hand, if you look at the question of should we go to the Olympics as though everything is normal, and should companies treat the 22 Olympics as a celebration of Chinese soft power, some have been suggesting that we should downgrade the level of government representation for the 22 Olympics over Xinjiang, and that in addition to that, companies ought to moderate the praise of China that would go into the usual Olympic hullabaloo. I was curious, this recommendation, incidentally, is in the new report, that the US-European report on relations with China. I was wondering what your reaction is to that recommendation.
I think it's a very delicate matter for China. They have a very challenging situation to deal with in Xinjiang, because it's one of those situations where you're not sure which way to go. I mean, if you take it very stringently and tightly, that may result in a pushback. If you ease up too much, that may result in a situation bursting forth elsewhere. And from an external point of view, if you take a view that you want to express moral approval or disapproval, then you have to try and make a calculation whether that will make a difference to your objective, and will that make things better or worse in China. And it's always delicate for a country to be publicly express disapproval of and to accept that and say, yes, I will learn and do better. I think no country in the world does that. So the question is how you're able to continue to operate with them, and yet at the same time, you have your views, they have their views, and well, without compromising your position, you maintain your dignity, but you do the business which is necessary. You've had to do that in many countries on many occasions. Your diplomats understand this problem.
Prime Minister, thank you. We have more questions than we could get to today. I'm going to hand it back now to Ambassador Burns, but my thanks to you for your time, for your candor, and as always, for your important participation.
Thank you.
Prime Minister, thank you very, very much. We really appreciated the wisdom, the balance, the pragmatic approach you have taken as Prime Minister, your country has taken in this very complicated region in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for being with us. We look forward to have you back in the future. And we wish you and your country all the best during this pandemic. Thank you very much. Evan, thank you for being such an expert interviewer. We're all going to read your book. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to transition to our next session, and that's going to be on the politics of the pandemic.